I think what happens is because there's so much stuff out there, it makes it much more likely that people will be very surface level about a lot of stuff, but not deep in anything in particular. Now, let me ask you, what are some things that you have done to try to counteract that in yourself, in your own playing?
Well, I would say I kind of grew up in an interesting time being a baby of the 90s, in that, I remember when there was no internet. I remember when, dial-up AOL was a thing. I remember when there were no cell phones. I remember when there was a car phone. I remember when there was a flip phone, so I don't have the perspective of my teachers who say, oh yeah, I listened to the same 5 records vinyl so much. I spun the records back to listen to every note of the Stanley Turrentine solo so many times that I grated the record into the ground. And I could sing along with every piano solo, every trumpet solo, every saxophone solo, every bass solo, because I only had 5 records, and that's what I listened to backwards and forwards, every which way. So I was kind of in between, because I was growing up at a time when Napster happened and LimeWire happened and Kazaa and BearShare and YouTube. And so, this explosion of access to, the entire scope of music and just information in general, I was starting my journey prior to that, and then diving into my journey, obviously, during that time. So I started some of the habits young, where, I was that person that listened to the CDs that were in my dad's car, that listened to the records that were in my grandma's house. And, those were the things that I wore out ad nauseum 1,000 times in a row. And I could tell you every song from, Doing All Right, Dexter Gordon, Freddie Hubbard album. I could sing every note of Dexter and Freddie. And I could also tell you the exact track listing of the Austin Powers Spy Who Shagged Me theme to the movie soundtrack, because that was one of the other CDs that was just in the car all the time. So that's what I had. And that's the stuff that I wore out. So I had kind of developed those muscles that come from, listening to a recording and listening to it 100 times, focusing on the drums, listen to it 100 times, focusing on the bass, listening to it 100 times, focusing on the solo, right? So that I had already kind of established those skills, that when, Pandora's box opened and now I could go on, Apple Music or iTunes, or I could go on YouTube and find any song I wanted, I kind of still knew the proper way to digest the music, because I think that was a big thing for me when I got to school and sat around and started listening to records with friends, is that when I was growing up, a lot of the times I just fast forwarded to the trumpet solo and I just transcribed the trumpet solo. And then I would sit around with all my friends in jazz school and we would listen to records, and they would stop it and rewind and say, man, did you hear that Phil Roy Haynes just played? Like, run that back. Did you hear that thing? Like, oh my God, did you hear that fill that, Tony played and Herbie played that chord and that made Wayne go off and do that? And it kind of opened up, listening to jazz music for me, because, it's really not a passive experience. You really have to be an active listener. And it's the kind of thing where you can listen to a track 5 times in a row and zero in on a different member of the band each time, and you're going to get something completely different out of it. And I think that kind of really focused listening maybe gets lost when, you're scrolling TikTok and the next thing comes up and the next thing comes up and the next thing comes up, or you're just on YouTube and 1 minute you're watching Snarky Puppy, then it's a grainy footage of a live concert from like Stockholm 66 second quintet. Then all of a sudden it's, like the next thing that, and it's like you said, if you have everything at your fingertips, naturally, it's going to be a little bit more of a glazed overview. You're not really diving in. And I think the study of jazz music, if you really are a student of the music, you have to give each kind of style, each era, each decade really requires your full attention to kind of assimilate that language into your playing. And if you're serious about playing jazz music, you have to know just as much repertoire and be able to play in the style of the 20s and the 30s as play in the 40s and 50s with bebop, as play hard bop and be able to hang on Wayne tunes and monk tunes from the 50s and then 60s and so on and so forth. So what I see with younger students now is like people that are just kind of, like you said, they're a little bit in on all these different things, but kind of the deep dive hasn't happened, you know?
Yeah. I mean, there's an issue. So the sort of surface level sort of altitude, or, you know, however you want to describe that, part of that is because there's less skin in the game, right? So in the past, if you wanted to get a recording, you had to pay for it, right? You had to, and then you couldn't own everything because, you know, even if you had, you know, a warehouse, I mean, you'd still run out of space at some point.
Yeah.
Right. And then the stuff like you were talking about, listening to something over and over and over, that was a natural, that was organic to not having as many recordings. Okay. So you have that going on. And then once you've developed that muscle, that sort of approach to learning stuff, spending a lot of time with it, listening to it differently, to try to access different instruments, an approach that I've taken to becoming a better composer and arranger for certain instruments is by learning that instrument. You know, so my first instrument, saxophone, alto saxophone, and then, you know, flute, clarinet, and then some crappy piano that I didn't really pay attention to until after I finished my master's degree. And then bass, guitar, and serious about piano, like playing a lot more piano.
Right.
So what happened was, as I sort of really got intense about each one of those things, when I would listen to recordings, they all sounded different. You know, so recordings that I'd heard for years and years and years, milestones. I listen to that record now actually understanding what the bass player is actually doing. It's just a different record, you know, and it also obviously makes you a better writer, and understand certain, you know, ergonomics and, you know, what's idiomatic to the instrument and all that kind of stuff. And you know, there's nothing more active as far as listening than transcribing, right?
Totally.
But not just transcribing solos, transcribing entire pieces of music. You know, everything, transcribing the entire thing. You know, I've, you know, transcribed, you know, orchestration, you know, dense orchestration. And a lot of that first starts out by deciding what the instrumentation is. Like, how many string parts are there? What are the string players? And figuring out all that kind of stuff. And that stuff you can take as far as you want to take it. But if that's never been part of the sort of process, but then also, even before you're born, all of the music in world history is available for free on YouTube. It's not likely that you're going to go backwards,
right,
to do that, to take that effort.
Absolutely.
And that's why I think folks, your age, you're about like you're like kind of like right on the fence almost, but your age and older, I think, can appreciate that, and I think can fully take advantage of having access of all this music, right? Because I think you'll still respect the music, you know, whereas I think it's very hard for folks you know, say in their 20s, mid 20s and younger,
right.
It's very hard for them, I think, to have the same kind of viewpoint. I think you can teach them how to do it if they have a good teacher, a good mentor. They can be taught to respect it. But I think the default is to just, you know, hey, this is here. I don't have to work for it.
Right.
You know, matter of fact, everything's already been transcribed. So, you know, it can turn into that.